Hello and welcome to part 2 of Soup to Nuts, a complete journey into long exposure photography. My name is Gerald Berliner. In this episode we'll be going behind the camera so we can review some of the shooting modes and functions your camera will need in order to shoot successful long exposures. I will also be touching on how to best review your captures on the back of the camera and also the setting up of a bracketed sequence of multiple exposures for possible high dynamic range processing, then finally culminating in a test long exposure shot so you can see all the steps and sequences involved in taking a long exposure capture. So let's get cracking and snapping. Hello, welcome to Soup to Nuts Part 2, and as you can quite clearly see here, we are behind the camera, so I can run through some of the features that it would be good for your camera to have if you are intending to shoot long exposure. Some of these features you're definitely going to need them. Some of them it would be nice if you did have them, and just things that you may want to bear in mind if you are upgrading to a new DSLR. To a higher specification DSLR, or in actual fact you are actually just migrating to an entry-level DSLR from a point and shoot. Well, first and foremost, if you are going to be doing or venturing into certainly more advanced post-processing, you're definitely going to want to move away from shooting in JPEG and move into shooting in the RAW format. Now, most DSL cameras now do afford you the ability to shoot in RAW. Now, basically, JPEGs are analogous to what MP3s are to music, in as much as they are very, very, very heavily compressed versions of the capture that your camera has taken. Now, in order to compress those files down to be smaller and more manageable, and send them around on the web, etc., 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 it actually dumps a lot of information out of the file, or from what the sensor has captured. So that is going to make it a lot more limited in terms of what you're going to be able to do with that image in post-production. But if you're shooting in RAW, that RAW is what it is. It's completely uncompressed, it's unfettered, it's not had anything done to it. It's basically what's just come straight off of the sensor. So therefore it is chock full of every ounce of digital information that your camera sensor or camera can capture. And that's going to give you much, much greater latitude and flexibility in post-process to do a wide range of adjustments, like changing white balance, like recovering blown highlights, opening up dark shadows, and a whole other host of tonal adjustments that it is going to be very, very beneficial if you are shooting in RAW. Now, a lot of cameras actually do give you the option to shoot both in RAW and JPEG at the same time. You'll take a shot and it'll shoot in RAW, but it'll also save a JPEG version. So, as I say, if you're kind of new to this, that is something you may want to consider before just plunging straight into RAW. When you do get to processing your RAW files, and we will get to that in later episodes, I'll show you my full workflow of doing that, you are going to need to have a RAW conversion software in order to be able to convert that RAW file into something that you can take into either Photoshop or wherever you want to take it. And there are a lot out there. There's Adobe Lightroom does it, Adobe Camera Raw does it, that comes bundled with Photoshop. There are also camera specific brands, like Nikon has its own RAW conversion software, and as I say, I think Aperture does it. I think just a little bit of research, but as I say, if you do shoot in RAW, not in the RAW, or maybe you do, I don't know, but that's none of my business. But anyway, just check, and realise you are going to need some RAW conversion software in order to be able to work on those files when you get them into the computer. So definitely shoot RAW. Now, if you're new to shooting with a DSLR, you get it out of the box, you want to go out shooting. The shooting mode that you're probably going to be in right out of the box is going to be auto mode. That is basically you turn the camera on, you point it at something, it'll focus for you, it'll meter for you, and it'll select the right aperture, and you'll take the shot, and basically it's going to take all the guesswork out of the process for you. As you get more advanced, you're probably going to want to move into, well, I say more advanced, but shooting modes that give you more control over what the camera does in terms of the aperture and the exposure time and things like that. Now this is my Nikon D800E, this is kind of fairly standard fare in terms of the shooting modes that I have on this. So just a question of just checking what your camera has, or you know, what you're going to want when you actually do purchase one. As I say, for the most part, I have a program mode, which is kind of like a little bit, it kind of does the same sort of thing as auto mode. There is the S mode, which is shutter priority. So a lot of, should we say, maybe sports photographers might use this, or people that are shooting moving objects, not necessarily long exposure. But what it'll mean is that you can then dial in whatever shutter speed you want, and it will correlate and pick what it thinks to be the best aperture reading for that exposure time. The other shooting mode that you'll probably find in your camera is aperture priority. Now that's actually pretty useful for long exposure photography, because what that will do is, as you open up and close down your aperture, it will then select a what it deems to be an appropriate exposure time for it. So like here at f7.1, it's saying that I'm going to need an exposure here of 1 second. Now this reading is really crucial for long exposure, because this is the reading that you're going to need to know before you put your ND filter on. That actually is going to obviously darken everything down, and using that number you'll then either use your long exposure conversion app or your chart to gauge what additional length of time the exposure is going to need to be, depending on whatever ND filter that you've got on the front of the camera. Now the last but by no means least, the most favoured shooting mode, which people tend to kind of like associate with being, you know, for more advanced shooters. I mean, I don't know, I've never kind of had much truck with that. I mean, basically what it is that the manual mode, which is the M here, basically gives you total control to adjust the aperture and the exposure value independently from one another to whatever purpose you need. Now, manual mode is going to be critical for long exposure photography, because now I'm dialing this back here for an exposure of 30 seconds. Now on all cameras, 30 seconds is the longest time that the camera itself will time for you when you take an exposure. Anything over above that, like 35 seconds, 45 seconds, a minute, however much longer, you're then going to need to be able to go into bulb mode. Now this is what I was talking about in the first episode when I said I would get to this later. We've now got to this. Bulb mode is going to be crucial on your camera to be able to go into if you want to take exposures and exposures over 30 seconds. Because what bulb is going to do is, as soon as you release or you press down the shutter, that the shutter is going to stay open for as long as you keep your finger holding down the button. So let's just take a quick shot. Okay, I'm still pressing down. I release the shutter, it takes the shot. Let's do it again. It doesn't matter how long. I mean, I could have my finger down here for like, 10 minutes. It would still be shooting. As soon as I release, it takes the shot. Now that also then ties into, from the first episode, why it's important in this bulb shooting mode to have a cable release. So again, you aren't having to stand there for 5-10 minutes with your hand on the camera, your finger on the shutter release. Having one of these, being able to do it. And what I also said was most important with any shutter or cable release that you get is going to be the ability for you to be able to lock that button down. And on this particular one, I can do by pushing the button down and moving the whole button unit forward. And there's a little lip here that in actual fact just locks that button down. So it's like my finger is still pressing down on it. And with that button down in bulb mode, that shutter is going to stay open for as long as I need the exposure to be. The way I end the exposure is just literally to push that back to release the button, shutter shuts down, the exposure is complete. That is also why, if you're using a wireless release, you need to be able to have a wireless release system that's going to allow you to hold that button down for a couple of seconds and then have the camera automatically keep the shutter open for as long as you need it to be, so that you then just click the button one more time, the exposure's finished. The problem with some of these wireless transmitters is that you have to keep your finger on that button pushed down the whole time in order to take the shot. You really don't want that. Let me just give you a demonstration here. If I press this button and keep it held down for a couple of seconds, a light will go out on it, and that means that it's actually holding the shutter open for me, and I can actually move away. I can take my hand off the finger, I can put this down and go and have a sandwich if I want. And then the only time that it will shut again is when I press the button again. So let me just demonstrate that. And watch that light goes out, I can take my finger off and the shutter will still remain open. So if I'm taking a 2-minute exposure, I just, however I'm timing it, just wait for 2 minutes to be up and I release it, and the shot's done. And obviously that's dreadfully overexposed. So, like I say, that is why bulb mode is going to be crucial for any long exposure photography that you do. You can only get to it in manual mode, and as I say, so look at your handbook, or as I say, just check if you are upgrading to a DSLR that you have got manual mode, which I'm sure you will do. But when you're in manual mode, you can go into bulb mode, so you can have the shutter open for as long as you need in order to take your long exposure photograph. Right, so let's quickly just take a look at the various kind of shooting modes that your camera can actually take a photograph in. Well, obviously, you got your camera, you point it at something, you press the shutter release, and it takes a single shot. That's because it's in single shot mode. Now, your camera may be able to go into different shot modes. On the D800E, there's a range of sort of different shooting modes that, again, maybe your camera doesn't have, but definitely the ones that would be useful to look out for, or look out for on a camera if you're intending to buy, or even the one you've got, is what is called continuous high, or some kind of burst mode that the camera, it's kind of like the old motor drive. It will, you press the shutter and it'll fire off a bunch of shots. This isn't going to be the most exciting shot in the world, but you hold the shutter down, it takes multiple exposures of the same thing. Continuous high is going to be very, very useful for HDR photography, high dynamic range photography, and we'll touch on that a little bit further down the line in this video. But again, continuous high is a pretty good thing to have as well. Now, most cameras will have a self-timer. Now, the self-timer actually could be useful to you, again, if you don't have a wireless release, or God forbid you've forgotten it, and you're looking at like a 10-15 second exposure. What you can do in order, again, the whole issue of keeping your hands off the camera, keeping the camera as stable and steady as possible, not introducing any kind of movement with any kind of vibration, is to set it into your self-timer. So obviously what you can do is you can just press your shutter, it'll start counting down, but you can then take your hands off. So that's actually, at a pinch, that's actually quite a useful thing to be able to do, to shoot hands-free. If you've got a long exposure and you, as I say, you've forgotten your cable release, or you don't actually quite have one at the moment. Now, the other shooting mode that would be useful to have, quite useful to have, and again, maybe not, your camera may not have it, but there's a shooting mode called mirror up. Now, mirror up is very, very useful to long exposure photography, and again, it ties back into camera stability. Let me just put this into single shot mode, and let's just listen for a second. Just listen to the sound this camera makes when it takes the shot. Right, there's that chung chung. Now, the chung, yes, that's the technical word. That first clunk is the mirror, your mirror in your DSLR. It's the thing that allows you to see through the viewfinder. That's the mirror flipping up, because the aperture and the sensor is behind that mirror, so the mirror is flapping up, and that split second the curtain and the shutter is opening, and then the whole thing is collapsing back down on itself to complete the exposure. Now, if you're taking a regular kind of pretty fast shot, I don't know, 200th of a second, that's probably not going to do too much in terms of introducing any kind of vibration. But with long exposure, you see what's happening is the mirror is coming up, and simultaneously that aperture, the shutter is opening as well. So any kind of slight, trust me, any kind of very, very slight vibration from the result of that clunk of the mirror coming up could creep in a little bit to the shot, because, as I say, the shutter is open and almost instantaneously that mirror comes up. So in mirror up mode, what it allows you to do, it's a two-press situation. The first press of the shutter release is just going to release the mirror. It's going to flick that mirror up. That's the first press. The mirror is up. The shutter's not open. Everything is still dark in there. It's not taking a shot yet. But when you press the shutter release again, the action of the shutter opening is minuscule. You can hardly hear it, and there's absolutely going to be no vibration at all. So is that click, click? Let me give you let's do a slightly longer exposure so you can just hear that a little bit more. Okay, 2 seconds. Here we go. Mirror up. First press, mirror comes up. Second press opens the shutter. That last clunk is everything collapsing down in on itself. Now, obviously, the sequence at the end is that the shutter will shut first, then the mirror flaps back down after it's shut, so you don't have an issue there with it moving at the end. Again, obviously, if you were then to couple shooting in mirror up with either your wireless release or a cable release, you're not going to have, first of all, you're going to even take this out of the equation. So what I would do, I'd have I'm set up to shoot, I'm in mirror up mode. First click of the button is going to raise that mirror. Just let the camera settle for 2 or 3 seconds after it. Just let everything die down from that clunk. Then just release the shutter. And the shot is taken. So no interference with the camera whatsoever. And again, shooting in mirror up is going to very, very slightly deaden any or reduce any kind of risk of any kind of softening of the image due to the any vibration set up from the clunk of that mirror coming up. Right, so let's just talk a little bit about image review once the shot's been taken on the back of your screen on the back of your camera. Let's just take a quick shot here, and there we are. Now, for the most part, when you're reviewing an image, particularly if you're not in a controlled lighting space like we are here, where you've got finite control over the lights, if you're going to be out in the field, chances are you're going to be in some pretty strong sunlight. There could be a lot of glare on this screen. The best way to review your image once you've taken it out in the field, or personally in any situation, is look to see if you have a screen that will show you the histogram. If you don't know what a histogram is, at this juncture I certainly recommend you scurry off and you go and have a look at YouTube and look at, there are loads of videos out there that will explain basically what a histogram is. Just very, very briefly, what a histogram is a diagrammatic representation of the tone, the exposure and tonal spread across the image itself, going from left to right. On the left is going to be all your darks and shadows. In the middle of it is going to be all the midtones. And on the right is going to be all your lights and your highlights. And then, quick way to remember this is just simply, well, the way I did when I first did it was right means white. So basically, on the right hand side is going to be all your, as I say, highlights and whites, midtones, and shadows and darks to the left here. And reading that histogram in the field is going to be the best way that you're going to have of evaluating how good an exposure that's going to be. So just even kind of looking at this one, it's not too bad. It's kind of falling a little bit short in the darks down there. I've got quite a lot of good mid-tone coverage here, but I'm seeing right here on the right here, I'm getting a white vertical line, a spike. Now that is indicating to me that I have got a highlight in there somewhere, and I would imagine it's probably the flames of those candles. Now there is another review screen that your camera probably will have, and that's the highlight warning screen. And yes, here it is. When viewing it, it just says highlights here because that's what it's doing. It's showing you where the highlights have blown out, and sure enough, I've got this flashing light, and it's showing me by flashing black and white here that those candles have blown out to kind of like, just pure white. So that will then allow you to go back in and make whatever exposure compensation you may want to make in order to darken down certain areas of the image in order to reduce those highlights down. But again, for something as minimal as that, I mean, if the whole thing was like flashing and the whole kind of, the lights were completely blowing the image out, you might have a problem. But a lot of the time, if you've only got very, very localized small amounts of kind of highlights, I would probably wager a bet that if you've been shooting in RAW, then you're going to be able to recover those highlights in post-processing in the RAW conversion software to be able to pull those back and tame down those sort of blown highlights. So again, another good reason to be shooting in RAW. But definitely when you're out in the field and you're chimping away trying to figure out if you've got a really nice looking shot. And again, it could be misleading because it may depend on what brightness level you've actually got your monitor set to or your screen set to here. So after you've taken a shot, you really want to get a true sense of the tonal balance throughout the image is to look at the histogram screen. Right, I don't want to get too off the mark here in digressing too much into HDR, but it may be worth covering it off while I'm here. HDR is very, very popular at the moment and has been for quite a while now. Basically HDR, as you may know, stands for High Dynamic Range. And what that basically does is it works off of multiple exposures of any given scene. And you usually use conversion software like Photomatics or Nik HDR, or Photoshop has got its own HDR processing component within it. But also if you want to be able to just more manually blend different exposures in together in Photoshop through luminosity masking, and I'll be showing you all about that when we get to the post-processing phase of this journey. Now, chances are when you're in if you're not in a controlled lighting situation, when you're out in out in the field, and you've got this wonderful stunning vista in front of you, and you've got it metered, you take a shot and you review it, and the foreground is beautifully exposed, but your sky is completely blown out. So okay, you're on the tripod, you'll then re-expose to get the sky nice and dark and all kind of interesting, or tonally a lot more kind of balanced. Sure enough, you'll probably find that your foreground is completely dark and black. So basically what HDR is, as I say, it's the ability to be able to take a range of different exposures of the same scene. Now, that's where bracketing comes into play on your camera. Now, most cameras will have a bracketing feature, and it's usually BKT, or a button that says BKT. And what that basically does is it sets up a sequence that the camera will shoot a number of frames at different exposure values. On most entry-level DSLRs, you'll probably have 3 frames or exposures that it'll take. Now, in this situation with 3 here, set up like this, what this camera would do is it would take one shot. Whoops, let's get that back. It will take one shot on exposure, it'll then fire one shot, one stop under exposure, then it will then shoot one frame with one stop over. Now, you can also, excuse me, if I just turn my sub command dial here, I can actually change the going from one stop in between each to 3/4 of a stop down to 1/3 of a stop if I want, you know, not quite such a big jump in between each exposure. But for the most part, people usually tend to leave it a one stop difference between each shot. As I say, now on the this D800E, I can actually go if I wanted to. Not quite sure why I'd want to, but anyway, I could actually go to 9 exposures. That would be one on exposure, and then 4 exposures. Sorry about that. 4 exposures under, and then 4 exposures over. If I wanted to get probably the greatest dynamic range in any scene since photography was invented. Let's go for a bracket of 5 exposures. 1 on exposure, 2 under, 2 over. Now, what I could then do is just fire or press the shutter 5 times. So let's do that. 1, 2, 3, 4. But let's just review what we've got. Right, this was our 1 on. This was our 2 exposures under. This was our 1 under exposure. Then the jump to +1 over, 2 +2 over, and you can see how everything is shunting way over to the right there, and a lot of clipping highlights there. But that's okay, because as I say, you may want that range to either blend yourself in post-processing or have the third-party software or whatever you're using, as say Photomatics or whatever. Now, there is actually a quicker way of doing that, and this actually ties into your burst mode. If you can have a burst mode or a continuous high, it is on the D800 here. You can just press that shutter down, and because you're in kind of like burst mode, the camera will then fire off automatically those 5 exposures. Now, what I would recommend here is to actually have another hand on the camera, just very, very lightly resting on top of it, because as this fires off and the mirror's flapping up and down as it's shooting off, again, you might just get a little bit of vibration happening there, softening some of the images. So having a hand there, just very, very gently, could possibly absorb some of that vibration. So anyway, let's give it a go. And you can see it's showing me that it's taken those 5 exposures, and I'm good to go. So I would then take those into the computer and then load them into Photomatics or whatever I'm going to use, if I'm going to use a piece of software, or I can then use them to bring them into layers in Photoshop and then blend them together using layer masks and luminosity masks, etc, etc, etc. So that is something quite useful to look out for on your camera if you have that capability. If you look at your bracketing sequences, how many you've got, and then also if you do have a motor burst setting on your camera, you can use that to fire off a bunch of a bracketed sequence for HDR processing. But what I think we'll do now is to take the world's most boring long exposure photograph. In terms of what I think I'd like to do now is just take you through the steps, supposing this was a beautiful cloudscape or wonderful babbling brook or stream or waterfall. Because I actually thought about doing this in the field at this level, and I think it's just going to be a lot easier for me to go through this in a safe, closed environment rather than trying to have to yell over the thunderous waterfall or howling winds up on one of the mountains around here. So bear with me, and what I'll do is I'm going to take you through the steps of how you would go about taking a long exposure photography, taking everything we've got, everything we've learned about, the filters, the cable releases, the wireless releases, and just go for it. Well, firstly, I'm going to move out of single shot into mirror up, because as I say, I want to keep the camera as stable as possible. Okay. Now, I am in aperture priority mode. I have composed my shot. I have auto-focused. I am tack sharp. I have a meter reading of 1.3. Now I'm going to put that in my head. I have a meter reading of 1.3 because this is the critical number, as I say, that you need to know before you put that filter on, because once that filter goes on, you then need to take that 1.3 number, or whatever that meter reading is, and look it up on your conversion chart to whatever ND filter you're going to be using, to be able to gauge how long that exposure is going to need to be with that filter on. Or conversely, you could then just use the long exposure calculator app that I showed you in the first episode. Either way, you need to calculate now what that length of time is. Now, your focus, you've got autofocus on. Before this ND filter goes onto your lens, get the camera or the lens out of autofocus mode into manual mode, so that once this goes on, and for all intents and purposes, you've blinded the camera, then once you trigger the shutter, the camera won't start trying to focus through this dark glass, which is obviously it's not going to be able to do, and you're back in the situation of having to take this back off, refocus, get it back on, remember to take it out of autofocus, and you're good to go. This is maybe for a little bit more advanced cameras. What I'm able to do on my D800E is I am able to reassign the metering and auto-focusing function away from my shutter release button to another button here on the back. So what that basically does is that when I press that shutter release, all it does is fire the shot. It doesn't try to autofocus. It doesn't do any meter readings. It literally just physically takes that shot. My metering and focus comes by, let's say, the ability to reassign that function to this button on the back, which is the autofocus on button. So as I say, I just need to press that. It'll autofocus and it'll do the reading, but it won't engage if I just press the shutter release. So as you see, when I pressed that shutter release, there was no beep beep or anything. It was just purely taking the shot. So that then means that I actually don't have to go through that palaver of, once I've got this on the front, of having to worry about the shutter release triggering the autofocus. So that's definitely something very, very useful. You may want to look at your camera, look at the handbook, see if there is a way that you can reassign the functionality of that shutter release button to get the metering and the autofocusing off of it and assigned to another button somewhere on the camera. Right, okay, so on it goes. I'm going to put the old ND6 on. Okay, alright, that's on there. Nice and snug, but not too tight. Okay, right, we're nearly there. So we have our 1.3. I am now going to call up the fact that I have an ND6 filter on there, and I have a reading of 1.3. So that's telling me that I'm going to need an exposure of around about 50 seconds. Right, so that means that I'm definitely going to have to go into bulb mode, because that is beyond the 30 seconds that the camera itself will be able to time for me on its own. So one other thing obviously that's going to be crucial, as I did mention in the first video, is at this juncture also that you want to find some way of covering your rear viewfinder if you're shooting in daylight, because light is going to get into the camera through that viewfinder if the exposure is like over 10 seconds upwards, a minute. Light will get in there and it will appear as a big magenta or white streak across your image. Okay, so whether you've got a rear viewfinder cap or you've got a visor that comes down like it does on the D800E, get that rear viewfinder covered somehow. Okay, right, now what we've got to do, I was in aperture mode, I'm now going to jump into manual mode. I am now going to dial this back so that I go beyond a 30-second exposure and into bulb mode. 25, 30, right, I'm now in bulb mode. I've got complete control over how long this aperture stays open. I am now going to press the button on my cable release once, just to bring the mirror up, wait a few seconds just for the whole thing to settle, and then on the next click of the wireless release, the shutter is going to open and I'm going to be in business. So I need to synchronize the second press of the button with starting this timer. So mirror up, let it settle. Okay, we're going to take the shot now and I'm going to start the timer. Light's gone out. I'm now in full bulb mode. I can now move away. Now I'm not going to make you sit here for nearly a minute, but I'll count this down when we get to around about 10 seconds to go. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, time up, end the shot, one click, there's the exposure. A fantastic static long exposure shot of some candles. But immediately, you know, I would go into histogram review mode so I can kind of see what's going on. It's kind of interesting. It is kind of slightly on the dark side. You know, a lot of the information is piled up over here on the left toward the darks. I've got some good, quite a lot of good mid-tone information here. A little bit lacking on the lights and the brights over here to the right. Just want to check to see if I do have any clipping on those. Yeah, I've got a little bit of clipping as per usual on that bright flame there, but that won't be a problem in RAW. I'd be able to kind of just claw that back quite easily in RAW. But, you know, obviously at this juncture, you know, that first shot I would probably guarantee is really going to be just to get you into the zone. It is pretty unlikely for a variety of reasons, mainly for dynamic range reasons, that you probably won't get that perfect shot in the first go round. But, you know, using the long exposure calculator, it definitely will get you in the zone, so you can then make your own decisions about whether or not you want to maybe add, you know, another 15, 20 seconds, 30 seconds, you know, if it's looking very underexposed, or, you know, you maybe want to cut back on the time, you know, if everything is obviously way too bright and the histogram's telling you've got a lot of highlight clipping going on. So again, you know, that's how you approach it. You know, that's the sequence of events if you're going to set up for a long exposure photograph. Now what I'm going to do in the next video is we are actually going to go out on location, so we can take everything that we've learned thus far and actually put it in practice out in the field and point out some of the other considerations that you're going to have to be aware of when you are actually shooting long exposure out in the field. So I hope this has been of some use, and thanks for watching, and I will catch you in part 3.